The sea has a way of stripping people down to what they really are. Out there, far from land, there is no audience, no applause, no second chances, only routine, discipline, and the quiet understanding that mistakes do not forgive themselves. In the winter of 1978, the North Sea was locked in one of its long, gray moods. Heavy clouds pressed low against the horizon, and cold waves slapped endlessly against steel hulls, moving cargo between worlds that pretended not to watch each other. On the bridge of a mid-sized cargo vessel called the Baltic trader, a man stood in silence, hands resting lightly on the railing, eyes fixed forward. To anyone who saw him, he was exactly what he appeared to be: Captain Robert Morrison, merchant marine, late 40s, a face weathered by decades of salt and wind, the permanent squint of someone who had spent most of his life staring at distant horizons. He looked ordinary in the way only real sailors do. No unnecessary movement, no nervous habits, just the calm presence of someone who belonged where he stood. And that was not an accident, because Robert Morrison was not a disguise he put on in the morning. He was a life that had been built slowly, patiently, until it became indistinguishable from the truth. The man known as Robert Morrison had a past that could survive scrutiny: maritime school records, licenses issued by real authorities, years of employment under other captains who would swear without hesitation that Morrison was competent, quiet, and unremarkable. There were calluses on his hands that no training program could fake, muscle memory that responded to the role of the ship before conscious thought, a vocabulary shaped by engines, weather, and cargo deadlines. For nearly 7 years, no one had questioned it.
What they did not know was that Robert Morrison did not exist before those 7 years. His name was David Keller, and long before he ever stepped onto a ship's bridge, his life had already been dismantled and rebuilt by careful hands. Deep cover is not about pretending, it is about becoming. The agency understood this. Papers alone were useless. A man with false documents but no instincts would collapse the moment something went wrong. So Keller was sent to live the life before he was asked to risk it. He learned the sea the slow way. He served under captains who shouted, ignored, and tested him. He stood watch on nights so cold that time itself seemed to slow. He made mistakes when mistakes were allowed, and learned from them when no one was watching. By the time he was given command of the Baltic trader, there was nothing left to correct. The ship itself was ordinary. That was its greatest asset. Registered in Liberia, carrying industrial cargo, following dull, predictable routes between Western Europe and the Baltic. Occasionally, it entered Soviet ports. That single detail made it invaluable. During the Cold War, access was currency. Satellites could photograph bases and count ships, but they could not smell fuel on the docks, or notice which vessels unloaded at night, or observe how procedures subtly changed when tensions rose. Merchant ships could. From the bridge, Keller watched Soviet ports with the eyes of a sailor, not a spy. That distinction mattered. He did not stare, he did not linger. He let information come to him naturally, absorbed through repetition. Patterns emerged slowly. Which naval ships appeared more frequently, which docks handled military cargo, which cranes operate after midnight. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just observation.
The Baltic trader carried no weapons, stole no documents, staged no bold escapes. That was intentional. Drama attracts attention, and attention destroys covers. Most days were painfully normal. Cargo was loaded, paperwork was signed, engines were checked. Crew members complained about weather, pay, and food. Keller drank moderately, just enough to seem social. He enforced discipline without cruelty. He ran a tight ship, but never reminded anyone who was in charge. His crew respected him in the way sailors respect someone reliable, not because he inspired them, but because he did not create problems. At night, alone in his cabin, the ship sounded different. The hum of engines, the distant slap of water against steel, the faint creaks of a vessel doing exactly what it was designed to do. Those were the moments when the weight settled in. 7 years was a long time to live inside another name.
Keller no longer had to remind himself who Robert Morrison was. The danger was the opposite, forgetting who David Keller had been. The agency trained operatives for loneliness, but training has limits. In exercises, there is always an end, a debrief, a safe room, a familiar face. In the field, time stretches. Birthdays passed unnoticed. Family members aged in photographs sent to a mailbox under a different name. People died believing lies that had been told for their protection. Keller's sister thought he worked in shipping logistics. His parents had died convinced their son lived a dull, respectable life at sea. And in a way, they were right. That was the paradox of deep cover. The lie had to be believable enough to be boring. For years, nothing went wrong. Then, in the autumn of 1977, far from the Baltic Sea, someone broke under pressure in Warsaw. A Polish dockworker, not an agent, just a man who talked too much over drinks, mentioned a foreign captain who asked unusual questions. The statement meant little on its own, but in the intelligence world, fragments are dangerous. Moscow listened. The warning reached Keller in a form only he would recognize. Short, clinical, devoid of emotion. Surveillance was increasing. Foreign merchant vessels were being reviewed. Continue operations, but reduce exposure. There was no order to withdraw. 7 years of preparation does not get abandoned on suspicion alone. At first, nothing seemed different. Ports operated as they always had. Officials stamped papers with the same bored expressions. Sailors moved cargo with the same efficiency. But Keller noticed what others did not. The extra glance that lasted a second too long. The man who stood near warehouses without unloading. The way questions were phrased. Casual on the surface, structured underneath. In Gdansk, he saw it clearly. A man in a dark coat, pretending to read a newspaper, appeared when the ship docked. 6 hours later, he was still there. He never approached, never spoke, never left. Keller did not acknowledge him. That was the rule. To react is to confirm importance. Instead, he did exactly what Captain Morrison always did. He supervised unloading. He complained mildly about delays. He joked about the cold. Inside, contingency plans unfolded in silence. If the net tightened, there would be no dramatic chase, no warning shot, just a knock on the cabin door that would not be ignored. By the time the Baltic trader reached Leningrad weeks later, the atmosphere had shifted further. Familiar faces avoided him. Conversations ended abruptly. Drinks were declined. When one freight supervisor finally spoke, his voice carried something Keller had not heard before. Fear. It was not fear of Keller. It was fear of being seen with him. Questions were being asked, not by dock officials, but by men whose questions did not appear on any form. Keller thanked him and walked away. The cover was still intact, but the margin was shrinking.
That night, lying in his bunk, Keller stared at the ceiling as the ship breathed around him. He had trained for pressure. He had rehearsed capture scenarios. What he could not rehearse was the waiting. The slow realization that the life he had built so carefully could collapse without warning, not because he failed, but because someone else talked at the wrong moment, in the wrong place. Outside, the harbor lights reflected off dark water. The sea did not care who he really was. And somewhere, men who had never met Robert Morrison were beginning to look for him. Suspicion does not arrive loudly. It seeps in, quietly, altering the shape of ordinary moments until nothing feels neutral anymore. For Keller, the days that followed in Leningrad felt stretched, distorted. Familiar routines remained unchanged on the surface, yet every small interaction now carried weight. A clerk hesitated before stamping a document. A port official asked a question twice, phrased slightly differently. A security officer lingered near the gangway longer than necessary. None of it was enough to justify action. Together, it formed a pattern. The most dangerous phase of deep cover is not exposure, it is uncertainty. If you know you are compromised, you move. If you know you are safe, you breathe. But when you do not know, every decision becomes a gamble. Keller responded the only way experience allowed, by becoming even more ordinary. He shortened conversations instead of extending them. He avoided familiar contacts rather than seeking reassurance. He limited his movements to areas any captain would naturally occupy. At night, when the ship quieted, he lay awake listening, not for footsteps,
for changes. Ships have their own language. The rhythm of engines, the creak of metal expanding and contracting, the distant echo of harbor activity. Keller knew those sounds intimately. What unsettled him was what did not belong. A door closing too softly, footsteps that stopped when he shifted position, the sense that someone was measuring time rather than killing it. The ship departed on schedule. Clearance was granted without incident. No inspections beyond the usual. That, paradoxically, was worse. When counterintelligence wants you, it rarely moves immediately. It watches first. It lets routine continue to see where it breaks.
3 weeks later, in Gdansk, Keller saw the man again. Same posture, different coat. The man stood near a warehouse entrance, pretending to be absorbed in a newspaper that never turned. He was there when the ship arrived. He was still there when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the docks. 6 hours. That length of patience did not belong to dock security. Keller did not look directly at him. Instead, he observed reflections, in windows, in puddles, in the polished surfaces of cargo containers. The man's eyes tracked movement, not cargo. It was confirmation. The Baltic trader was no longer invisible. Still, Keller did not change course. That night, as paperwork was completed and the crew settled into their routines, Keller did something he had avoided for months. He allowed himself to think beyond the next port. If extraction became necessary, it would not be clean. Removing a deep cover operative after 7 years was not like pulling someone from a hotel room. Every relationship, every paper trail, every habit had to be dismantled without leaving obvious gaps. And there was another problem. The ship. The Baltic trader was not just transport, it was an intelligence platform. Removing Keller without confirming exposure would mean abandoning years of patient access. Langley would hesitate. That hesitation could be fatal. The pressure built quietly until it found an outlet where Keller least expected it. Henrik Johansson. The first mate had served with him for 4 years. A Norwegian by birth, reserved by nature. He did his job well, spoke little, and never asked questions that did not belong to his role. Until one evening, as the ship prepared to depart, Johansson knocked on Keller's cabin door. There was no urgency in the knock, no hesitation either. That combination made Keller reach instinctively for the knife in his desk drawer. In intelligence work, paranoia is not a flaw, it is maintenance. Johansson entered and closed the door behind him. He did not sit immediately. That mattered. "Captain," he said, carefully, "I need to speak with you privately." Keller nodded, offering no encouragement. Johansson took a breath, then said the words that froze the room. "I know you're not just a merchant captain."
The silence that followed was not accidental. Keller let it stretch, watching Johansson's face for signs of performance, tension too controlled, eyes searching for reaction. He saw none. "I don't know what you mean," Keller replied calmly. "I'm exactly what I appear to be." Johansson shook his head, slowly. "I've worked these routes long enough to recognize patterns. 2 years ago, in Copenhagen, I saw you meet someone. Not like sailors meet, not like businessmen meet." Keller said nothing. Johansson continued, voice steady but quiet. "You don't drink enough for a man who should be tired. You notice things others don't. And recently, people have started watching us." The danger in that cabin was absolute. If Johansson was a Soviet plant, the conversation alone could justify arrest. Keller measured his next words carefully. "Why are you telling me this now?" Johansson exhaled, shoulders relaxing slightly. "Because it's getting dangerous," he said, "and because I don't work for Moscow." That claim meant nothing on its own. Then Johansson added something that changed the equation. "My cousin was killed in Hungary, 1956, Soviet tanks." It was not a dramatic statement. It did not need to be. Keller understood what was being offered. Not loyalty, alignment. In that moment, denial would protect Keller, but gain him nothing. Admission would gain him help, or destroy everything. So Keller chose a third path. "If I were what you think I am," he said slowly, "what kind of help could you offer?" Johansson understood the dance. He did not smile. He did not press. "I know people," he said. "Sailors, dock workers, fishermen. men who move things quietly. If you need information moved or someone hidden, I can help. Keller studied him. The risk was enormous. The alternative was isolation. That night, Keller made the most dangerous decision of his career, not an operation, but a trust. Over the following days, nothing explicit was said. There were no confessions, no documents exchanged, but cooperation began. Johansson adjusted schedules subtly. He diverted conversations. He watched the watchers. Through his network, Keller sent a message, not by radio, not by coded transmission, but by human chain. A fisherman, a cousin, a consulate clerk who knew which envelope mattered. The message reached Langley weeks later. Surveillance increasing. Cover under pressure. Guidance requested. While waiting for response, Keller maintained routine with surgical precision. He was neither cautious nor careless. He existed exactly as Captain Morrison should. The reply, when it came, carried no comfort. Continue operations and extract an asset.
The man, codenamed Nightingale, was a Soviet naval engineer with access to submarine technology. Internal security reviews were accelerating. Land routes were compromised. Maritime extraction was the only option. The timing could not have been worse. Counterintelligence was already alert. Any deviation from routine would be noticed. Keller stared at the message long after he finished reading it. Deep cover agents are not meant to perform extractions. They are meant to survive. But Nightingale's information mattered. It could alter naval balance. That calculation outweighed risk. The operation moved forward. Tallinn in February was a city of gray stone and colder faces. The Baltic trader docked as it always had. Papers were presented. Cargo was listed. No questions out of place. 6 hours passed, then 12. No contact. Every minute increased danger. Abort protocols crept closer. Then finally, a dock worker approached with a problem, a discrepancy in paperwork. It was the signal. In a warehouse office near the waterfront, Keller met Nightingale. The man was thin, exhausted, terrified. "They know something is wrong," Nightingale whispered. "I have maybe 1 day." The plan they had prepared was no longer viable. Keller assessed the man quickly. Fear too real to fake. Hands shaking, not from cold alone. There was no clean solution left. Only improvisation. Keller returned to the ship and found Johansson. "I need a distraction," he said. Loud, confusing, not dangerous. Johansson thought for a moment. 30 minutes, he replied. What followed was chaos engineered with precision. A cargo crane malfunctioned. A pallet crashed. Shouting erupted. Officials ran. Arguments flared. In the confusion, Keller returned to the warehouse with work clothes. Nightingale left as another laborer. He disappeared behind a false wall in the cargo hold. Inspections followed. Soviet authorities were thorough, but routine remained their weakness. The Baltic trader had a clean history. Captain Morrison's paperwork was flawless. The ship was cleared. As the harbor fell away behind them, Keller did not relax. The most dangerous part was still ahead.
The moment the harbor disappeared behind them, the ship felt different. Not because anything had changed. Engines ran smoothly, the crew followed routine, the sea behaved as it always had. But because Keller knew the truth, there was no turning back now. Deep inside the cargo hold, hidden behind a false bulkhead designed years earlier for a situation no one hoped would come, a man was holding his breath in the dark. Every mile the Baltic trader traveled carried him farther from safety and closer to either freedom or a prison that had no official records. Keller stood on the bridge, eyes forward, posture unchanged. This was the most dangerous phase of any covert operation, not the extraction itself, the aftermath. When something disappears inside a closed system like the Soviet Union, the response is not immediate chaos, it is methodical correction. Files are checked, schedules reviewed, patterns compared, and ships that were once invisible become interesting. For the first 24 hours, nothing happened. The Baltic Sea stretched wide and gray around them. The crew settled into the familiar rhythm of open water. Meals were eaten, watches rotated. Engines hummed with the dull reliability of machinery that had no understanding of geopolitics. Keller did not allow himself to relax. Relaxation was a habit that killed people like him. On the second day, just after dawn, the radar operator spoke quietly. "Contact astern." Keller stepped closer to the display without urgency. A single blip, small, steady, a patrol vessel. It maintained distance,
far enough to be ignored under normal circumstances, close enough to make ignoring it a conscious choice. Keller did not react. Soviet patrol boats often observed foreign vessels in international waters. There was no violation, no cause for confrontation. But this one did not fall back. Hour after hour, it matched their course. 2 kilometers behind, close enough to watch, too far to accuse. This was not enforcement. This was attention. Keller logged the contact calmly, noting it as routine naval observation. That was what Captain Morrison would do. Panic would not change the situation. Speed would only raise questions.
Inside, calculations unfolded with relentless clarity. If the patrol boat stayed with them, the rendezvous would be impossible. If Keller aborted, Nightingale would remain aboard, turning the ship into a liability. If the submarine surfaced under observation, the consequences would extend far beyond the Baltic trader. This was no longer a single man's risk. It was an incident waiting to happen. Keller called Johansen to the bridge. They did not speak immediately. Both men stared out at the sea, pretending the conversation was about weather and navigation. "The shadow isn't accidental," Johansen said quietly. "No," Keller replied. "It isn't." They reviewed charts together, fingers tracing routes that appeared ordinary on paper, but carried political weight in reality. Then Keller saw it. Fishing grounds. Swedish waters, crowded with trawlers, nets, lights, radio chatter. A place where caution was expected, where speed reductions were normal, where confusion was not suspicious. "The patrol boat won't want to push too close there," Johansen said. "They won't," Keller agreed. "They'll observe," which was all Keller needed. The course adjustment was minor, legitimate, logged without comment. As the Baltic trader approached the fishing grounds, traffic increased. Small vessels crisscrossed the water, their lights blinking in uneven patterns. Nets extended invisibly beneath the surface, forcing large ships to slow and maneuver carefully. Keller reduced speed. Any prudent captain would. Behind them, the Soviet patrol boat hesitated. International waters were one thing. Swedish proximity was another. Aggressive maneuvering here could create diplomatic questions no one wanted to answer. The distance widened slightly. Then darkness began to fall. Fog rolled in uneven sheets across the water, swallowing lights and reshaping distances. The sea became a moving puzzle of reflections and shadows. For the first time since leaving Tallinn, Keller allowed himself a narrow margin of hope. He waited. When visibility dropped enough to blur outlines, Keller made the most dangerous decision of the entire operation. He ordered the exterior lights turned off. It was a violation of maritime safety rules. It was also necessary. The Baltic trader became a darker shape among dozens of others, indistinguishable without close observation.
Minutes stretched. Then, from the water ahead, something changed. A shape surfaced. Not suddenly, not violently. A submarine rose with the deliberate patience of a machine designed to remain unseen. It did not announce itself. It did not light itself. It simply existed. Keller felt the shift more than he saw it. A subtle alteration in the sea's behavior, a mass displacing water where none should be. Johansen coordinated silently. The crew, unaware of the true purpose, followed instructions that made sense within their limited understanding. Below deck, Nightingale was brought from his hiding place. Daze and darkness had drained him. His movements were stiff, his face pale, but he was alive, and he understood that this was the moment everything depended on. No words were exchanged. A rubber boat slipped from the submarine. Hands reached up. Nightingale was guided down. 5 minutes. That was all the time they allowed themselves. No engines revved. No orders were shouted. No lights betrayed them. The boat returned to the submarine. The submarine slipped beneath the surface, reclaiming its natural state. Absence. Keller ordered the ship's lights restored and speed resumed. From a distance, the Baltic trader became what it had always been, a cargo vessel moving toward Stockholm, minding its own business. Hours later, in the pale light of morning, the patrol boat reappeared. It followed for a time, as if reluctant to admit it had lost something important. Then it turned away. There was nothing to stop, nothing to board, nothing to accuse. Only suspicion, unsupported by proof. Keller logged the encounter with emotion. Routine observation, no incidents. That was the art of survival.
The aftermath unfolded quietly. The CIA debriefed Nightingale for months. His information reshaped Western understanding of Soviet submarine capabilities. It influenced budgets, designs, and doctrines that would matter years later.
Keller received no public recognition. That, too, was routine. His cover remained intact, but instructions changed. Active intelligence gathering was reduced. The Baltic trader was still useful, but caution now outweighed curiosity. Johansson was never officially recruited. He did not need to be. Compensation arrived through channels designed to look like coincidence. Loyalty, in the intelligence world, was sustained by discretion. For 2 more years, Keller remained at sea. He photographed from greater distances. He avoided unnecessary contact. He survived. The end came not with discovery, but with bureaucracy. By 1980, priorities shifted. Resources were redirected. The agency chose to extract Keller while it could, rather than gamble against time. The extraction was clean, professional, almost gentle. After 7 years as Robert Morrison, David Keller returned to a life that felt unfamiliar. He missed the sea. He missed the routine. He even missed the quiet tension. The Baltic trader was sold, its compartments removed, its secret history erased. Johansson retired quietly in Norway. Nightingale lived under another name, and Keller never returned to the field. The Cold War would produce countless stories like this, most of them never told. Men who lived lies so completely they became truth. Ships that carried more than cargo, and oceans that never cared who anyone really was. Success in intelligence rarely feels like victory. More often, it feels like the absence of disaster. After the Baltic trader slipped quietly back into routine routes, the world did not change overnight. There were no headlines, no diplomatic protests, no public consequences. From the outside, nothing had happened at all. That was how Keller knew the operation had worked. Nightingale vanished into the machinery of resettlement, his former life erased line by line. He would spend months answering questions in quiet rooms, watched by people who measured truth not by emotion, but by consistency. His information mattered. It altered naval assumptions. It shifted calculations that would echo through the 1980s. But Keller would never see the full impact. Deep cover operatives are not rewarded with clarity. They move on.
For Keller, moving on meant returning to the bridge of the Baltic trader as if nothing had occurred. Cargo manifests still needed signing. Engines still needed listening to. Weather still had to be respected. The sea did not acknowledge heroics. But something had changed. Not in the procedures, in the silence. Before Tallinn, Keller's isolation had been controlled, chosen, necessary. Afterward, it felt heavier. The knowledge that he had come close to disappearing, not metaphorically, but literally, settled into him like ballast. He had made decisions that could not be undone. He had trusted a man who could have destroyed him, and he had carried another human being through a point of no return. And yet, no one could know. That is the private cost of deep cover. You cannot share the weight without revealing the truth. Johansson continued as first mate, outwardly unchanged, but their working relationship had transformed. They spoke less, but understood more. No acknowledgement passed between them, no gratitude expressed. In their world, silence was respect. Months passed. Surveillance pressure gradually eased. The Baltic trader remained on watch lists, but not under constant scrutiny. The Soviets never found proof. Suspicion without evidence eventually exhausts itself. Keller adapted. He observed from farther distances. He noted changes without probing causes. He allowed opportunities to pass. The work became slower, safer. In intelligence, survival is a form of competence. By 1980, geopolitical priorities shifted. Resources moved. Operations were reassessed not for risk but relevance. Somewhere in a quiet office, a decision was made. David Keller's operation would end, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded long enough. Extraction under intact cover was a rarity. Most deep cover agents left in handcuffs, coffins, or not at all. Keller was lucky. The plan unfolded with clinical precision. Captain Morrison took leave. Another captain took command. Paperwork closed itself neatly. One day, Keller stood on the dock watching the Baltic trader depart without him.
For 7 years, that ship had been his world. Its rhythms had replaced his own. Its routines had given structure to a life built entirely on restraint. Watching it disappear felt like losing something real. The return to his true identity was more difficult than any operation. David Keller had to remember how to exist without a role.
He had spent years thinking like a captain, practical, contained, focused on immediate realities. In offices at headquarters, that mindset felt out of place. The sea had trained him to accept uncertainty. Bureaucracy demanded explanations. Psychological support was offered. It always is. But no therapist can fully bridge the gap between a life lived and a life erased. Keller missed the simplicity of routine. He missed the clarity of risk. He even missed the low-level fear that sharpened attention. Civilian life felt loud. In meetings, people spoke too much. They worried about things that did not matter. They assumed safety was permanent. Keller knew better. He worked analytical roles quietly, contributing experience rather than drama. He never returned to the field. That chapter had closed completely. The Baltic trader, stripped of its hidden compartments, continued commercial routes under new ownership. Its secret history vanished with the removal of false walls and concealed panels. Johansen retired years later to a small town in Norway. He never spoke publicly about his involvement. He did not need recognition. He had chosen a side long before Keller arrived. Compensation arrived discreetly, enough to live comfortably, enough to ensure silence. In intelligence, loyalty is sustained by understanding, not gratitude. Nightingale lived out his life under a new name, contributing quietly to defense work until his death. He never learned how close his escape had come to failure, or how many people had risked everything without expectation of acknowledgement. That is also routine. The story of David Keller remained classified for decades. When fragments emerged years later, they appeared incomplete, sanitized, stripped of tension. That is inevitable. Records capture actions, not hesitation. Documents list outcomes, not doubt. Those who knew Keller spoke of him with respect, but never publicly. In the intelligence community, memory is selective by necessity. The Cold War produced thousands like him. Not the famous defectors, not the names in headlines, but the quiet operators who lived entire lives that could not be acknowledged. Men who carried the discipline to wake up every day as someone else, and the restraint to never correct the record. They gathered information slowly, patiently, without expectation of survival or recognition. They accepted that success meant remaining invisible.
Today, satellites watch everything. Sensors listen constantly. The era of maritime deep cover is largely over. But for a time, intelligence depended on men standing on ship bridges, watching harbors with human eyes, understanding context no machine could yet provide. They watched, they waited, they endured. And when history moved on, they disappeared without complaint. The Baltic Sea still carries cargo ships between familiar ports. Most are exactly what they appear to be. But during those tense decades, some carried something else. A man living a lie carefully enough to make it true. A ship that mattered more for what it observed than what it delivered. A quiet contribution to a balance that prevented far worse outcomes. David Keller was one of many, and like most of them, his greatest achievement was never being noticed at all. There is a reason deep cover is considered one of the most destructive assignments in intelligence work. Not the most dangerous, not the most dramatic, the most corrosive. For most intelligence officers, danger comes in bursts: a mission, an operation, a moment of exposure followed by resolution. Even failure has shape. Deep cover has none of that. It is not a sprint. It is erosion. Day after day, the operative wakes up as someone else. Not acting, not pretending, living, responding instinctively, building memories that belong to a name that cannot be acknowledged. Over time, the mind adapts, and that adaptation is the problem. Psychologists who later studied long-term undercover operatives noticed a pattern. Intelligence agencies had understood it intuitively for decades. The human brain does not tolerate ambiguity of identity. When forced to choose, it commits. If you live as Robert Morrison long enough, you stop thinking of him as a role. He becomes the default. David Keller did not consciously forget himself. He did not sit in his cabin questioning who he was. That kind of breakdown is rare. Instead, something quieter happened. His reactions aligned with the cover. His instincts belonged to the ship.
His emotional responses adjusted to what Captain Morrison would feel. The longer this continued, the harder it became to locate the original self without effort. This is why deep cover operatives often struggle more after extraction than during the mission itself.
During the operation, everything has purpose. Every restraint has meaning. Every silence is survival. Afterward, there is no structure. Keller returned to a world where people spoke freely about plans and fears, where names meant what they said, where no one measured every sentence for consequences. That freedom felt unnatural. Many former deep cover operatives described the same sensation. Not relief, disorientation. They miss the clarity of limitation. They miss the focus imposed by risk. They miss knowing exactly what must not be said. Civilian life demands a flexibility they no longer trust. Relationships suffer. How do you explain years of absence without lying, when lying has become second nature? How do you share memories that never officially existed? Some operatives withdraw. Others overcompensate. A few attempt to return to the field, only to realize that deep cover has permanently altered their internal compass. Agencies learned this the hard way. During the Cold War, both sides treated deep cover personnel as consumable assets. The mission mattered more than longevity. Psychological damage was an acceptable cost. Extraction was rare, not because it was impossible, but because it was inconvenient. The longer someone remained embedded, the more valuable they became. Pulling them out early felt wasteful, and so many stayed until something broke. Some were exposed, some defected, some disappeared. The ones who survived often carried invisible injuries. Keller was luckier than most. He left with his cover intact. He left before the line between role and self fully collapsed. But even then, the separation was painful. He had spent years making decisions alone, trusting only his own judgment. That habit did not dissolve easily. In meetings, he spoke less than expected. He listened for things others ignored, inconsistencies, hesitations, patterns that did not belong. Colleagues saw him as reserved, competent, hard to read. They were right. Deep cover trains you to minimize footprint, to exist without imprint. That skill does not disappear simply because the assignment ends. There is also guilt. Not the guilt of wrongdoing, but of survival. Keller knew others who had not been extracted cleanly. He knew stories that never became public. He understood that his ending was an exception, not the rule. That awareness lingered. Why him? Why this outcome? There are no satisfying answers. Intelligence work does not reward fairness. It rewards timing. For agencies, deep cover was eventually deemed too costly in human terms. Technology reduced the need for such sacrifice. Satellites replaced observation. Signals intelligence replaced presence. But technology still lacks context. Machines see patterns. Humans understand meaning. That is why deep cover has never fully disappeared, only narrowed. Even now, when intelligence professionals discuss the most demanding assignments, deep cover is spoken of with a particular tone. Not admiration, respect mixed with reluctance. It is understood that anyone who accepts such a role will not return unchanged. Keller never spoke publicly about his experience. He did not write memoirs. He did not lecture. Silence was not imposed on him. It was chosen, because some truths lose coherence when exposed to daylight. The sea had taught him that. Out there, identity is simple. You are what you do, moment to moment. Titles matter less than competence. Names matter less than reliability. Perhaps that is why Keller missed it. Not the danger, not the fear, the clarity. In the end, the Cold War faded, not with explosions, but with exhaustion. Systems that relied on secrecy eventually collapsed under their own weight. What remains are fragments, declassified files, incomplete stories, shadows of lives lived under names that no longer exist. David Keller was one of many, a man who gave up the comfort of being known in exchange for the discipline of being useful. He did not win the Cold War. He did not change history alone, but he stood watch when it mattered, quietly, patiently, without expecting recognition. And in the intelligence world, that is as close to success as anyone ever comes.
When stories like this are told,
There is often an expectation of revelation, a final confession, a dramatic exposure, a moment when the truth steps into the light and demands recognition. But that expectation belongs to fiction. Real intelligence work does not end with applause. It ends quietly, with files closed, names forgotten, and lives resumed under conditions that no longer require explanation. David Keller did not walk away from the sea as a hero. He walked away as a man who had learned how fragile identity truly is. For 7 years, he lived inside a name that was never his. He carried responsibilities that could never be acknowledged. He made decisions whose consequences would only be understood by people who were not allowed to speak about them. When the Cold War ended, no one came looking for Robert Morrison. That name had served its purpose. The world moved on. Ports remained busy. Ships continued to cross familiar routes. The Baltic Sea returned to being just a sea. But beneath that surface, something lingered. An era when information moved not only through satellites and signals, but through human eyes, human patience, and human restraint. An era when men stood on bridges in the cold, watching harbors that pretended not to matter, gathering fragments of truth one uneventful day at a time. Most of them were never discovered. Most of them were never rewarded. Most of them were never remembered. And that was the point. Intelligence work does not seek legacy, it seeks advantage. Sometimes it seeks only balance, the quiet prevention of something worse. The Cold War did not end because of a single operation or a single person. It ended because countless invisible actions accumulated until systems could no longer sustain the tension they created. David Keller's life as Robert Morrison was one of those actions, not decisive on its own, but necessary. In the end, perhaps the most unsettling truth is not how effective such lives were, but how easily they disappear, without records, without monuments, without anyone left to tell the story. What remains are traces, declassified fragments, stories reconstructed from absence, and somewhere between the lines, a reminder. History is not shaped only by leaders in battles. It is shaped by individuals willing to live entire lives without recognition, people who trust that what they protect matters more than being known. The sea does not remember them, but for a time it carried them, and that was enough.